February 17, 2026. Persian Gulf, 0510 hours. The USS Laboon, hull designation DDG-58, is threading a course through waters that the Islamic Republic of Iran considers its sovereign backyard. She is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, Flight 1 configuration, displacing 8,315 tons fully loaded, carrying 90 vertical launch cells, a 5-inch deck gun, 2 phalanx close-in weapon systems, and a crew of 281 men and women who have been awake, most of them since before midnight. She is moving at 12 knots through the western approaches of the Persian Gulf, and her track line, when plotted on a nautical chart, places her within 11.4 nautical miles of the Iranian coastline. 11.4 nautical miles. Just inside what Iran claims as its 12-mile territorial sea boundary, adjacent to the offshore oil infrastructure that generates approximately 60% of the Iranian government's operational revenue. On Iranian radar screens at the Bandar Abbas Naval Complex and on the fast patrol craft of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, that track line looks like a provocation. It looks like the United States deliberately threading a warship into the most economically sensitive maritime zone in the Iranian Republic. It looks like a dare. To the IRGCN commanders watching the Laboon's contact blip cross their claimed boundary, it looks like the Americans have made a catastrophic miscalculation in their own arrogance. They are absolutely certain the Laboon doesn't belong there and cannot survive long if they decide to make that point with force. They are wrong on both counts, and the error in their reasoning is far more consequential than any tactical miscalculation. Today, on Navy Dissected, we dissect exactly why the Laboon was precisely where she was supposed to be. Why that position was not a provocation but a precision calculation, and why any Iranian attempt to enforce their claimed boundary against an American destroyer would end in a result the IRGCN has not fully modeled and cannot survive intact. To understand what the Laboon was doing inside Iran's claimed 12-mile zone and why it was operationally rational rather than reckless, you first have to understand the threat environment she was navigating. Because dismissing the Iranian capability in the Persian Gulf as insignificant would be a mirror image error of the one the IRGCN is making about the Laboon. The Iranians have built a genuine, layered, asymmetric threat architecture in the Persian Gulf that has been 20 years in continuous development, is funded by oil revenues that survived even the most aggressive sanctions regimes, and is specifically engineered to defeat the kind of American naval power that the Laboon represents. Their doctrine is not ignorant. It is not unsophisticated. It is incomplete in ways they do not yet fully understand. But its surface-level logic is compelling enough to demand serious analysis before we explain why it fails. The primary surface threat to a destroyer-class vessel operating in confined Persian Gulf waters comes from the IRGCN's fleet of fast inshore attack craft, what Western intelligence designates generically as FIAC, which Iran operates in numbers that have been estimated between 100 and 200 active hull count in the Persian Gulf alone. These are not trivial platforms. The Siraj-class and Zulfagar-class fast attack craft operate at speeds between 60 and 75 knots, roughly 3 to 4 times the sprint speed of a fully loaded Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. They carry C-14 anti-ship missiles with a range of approximately 25 kilometers, roughly 15.5 miles. They carry rocket-propelled grenade launchers, heavy machine guns, and, in some documented configurations, torpedoes. Their radar cross-section is extremely small, in the range of 0.1 to 1 square meter, depending on sea state and aspect angle, which means they can approach to within 10 miles of a target before most ship-mounted surveillance radars acquire them reliably above sea clutter. And they are cheap. An IRGCN fast attack craft costs between $500,000 and $1.5 million to build and equip, and a single EOR-IM-162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, ESSM, fired from the Laboon to defeat one of these craft costs The United States approximately $1.5 million per round. At parity or worse in per-engagement economics, if the IRGCN can force the Laboon to expend interceptors against swarm attacks, they can theoretically exhaust her defensive magazine before she reaches the exit of the Persian Gulf. Their doctrine calls this cost exchange attrition, and on a spreadsheet with simple assumptions, the logic is coherent. The second and more strategically significant threat layer comes from Iran's anti-ship missile inventory mounted on fixed and mobile coastal defense batteries along the Persian Gulf shoreline. The Noor anti-ship cruise missile, the Iranian domestically produced variant of the Chinese C-802, which NATO tracks under the reporting name CSS-N-8 Saqqad, has a published range of 170 kilometers, approximately 105 miles, and carries a 165-kilogram warhead. What it flies a sea-skimming profile at between 5 and 15 meters above the wave surface, below the radar horizon of any ship whose radar is constrained by Earth's curvature to detect only contacts above a certain altitude threshold at extended range. For a ship-mounted radar at 10 meters above sea level, a target flying at 10 meters altitude disappears below the radar horizon at approximately 12 to 13 nautical miles due to Earth's curvature. That means the Noor can approach to within 12 miles before a destroyer's own radar detects it, the same 12 miles as the territorial boundary the Laboon just crossed. Do the math. 105 miles of launch range minus 12 miles of radar horizon equals 93 miles of flight time during which the Laboon cannot independently detect the incoming weapon using her own organic sensors. 93 miles of blind approach. At the Noor's subsonic cruise speed of approximately 0.8 Mach, or 612 miles per hour, that 93-mile blind approach phase takes approximately 9 minutes. 9 minutes of a 165-kilogram warhead approaching at wave-top altitude, completely invisible to the target ship's own sensors. On paper, that's a decisive tactical advantage. Add the Khalij Far's anti-ship ballistic missile, the Iranian domestically produced MARV-equipped weapon derived from the Fateh 110 family. With its published range of 300 kilometers, 186 miles, and its maneuvering re-entry vehicle terminal phase designed specifically to defeat shipborne missile defense systems by performing evasive maneuvers during final approach. An Arleigh Burke Flight 1 destroyer like the Laboon is not equipped with the SM-3 exoatmospheric interceptor. Her vertical launch cells carry SM-2 standard missiles for medium-range air defense and ESSMAs for close-range threats. But her capacity against a maneuvering ballistic missile re-entry vehicle is significantly more limited than a Flight 3 destroyer or a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The IRGCN planners have studied the Laboon's configuration in detail. They know her hull designation. They know her flight variant. They know her weapons loadout from open-source publications and prior deployment records. They have a specific capability gap assessment for her. And that assessment shows that a coordinated salvo of Khalij Far's ballistic missiles combined with simultaneous Noor cruise missile launches from multiple bearings represents a genuine threat to a Flight 1. Arleigh Burke operating without close air support coverage. The historical precedent that they study most closely is the USS Stark incident of May 17, 1987, when two French-built Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi Mirage F-1 aircraft struck the USS Stark FFG-31 while she was on patrol in the Persian Gulf, killing 37 American sailors and nearly sinking the ship. The Stark's defensive systems were operational. Her crew was trained. The threat arrived faster than the human decision cycle could process and authorize an engagement response. The IRGCN has memorized every detail of that event. They have built their entire anti-ship doctrine around replicating it at scale. The cost comparison they present to their commanders is stark and deliberate. A Khalij Far's missile costs approximately $2.5 million to produce. The Laboon represents a program cost of approximately $1.2 billion and 281 irreplaceable American lives. A single successful strike in their calculation, generates a strategic disruption disproportionate to the weapon's cost by a factor of nearly 500. On paper, at that exchange rate, this looks like a no-lose proposition. On paper, yet this looks like an Iran that holds the tactical advantage in its own backyard. They are solving the right problem with the wrong variables, and the variable they've gotten wrong changes every conclusion they've reached. Before the first IRGCN radar operator begins his shift tracking the Laboon's progress through the Persian Gulf, before the first fast attack craft commander receives a situation report on the American destroyer's position and course, before the first coastal defense battery crew is notified that a U.S. Navy warship has crossed into the claimed 12-mile zone, an intelligence picture has already been built with a completeness and depth that the IRGCN cannot replicate and cannot fully comprehend they are operating inside. The invisible war that precedes every visible naval encounter in this theater is not fought with missiles or guns. It is fought with electrons, acoustics, photons from space, and the systematic collection and fusion of information at a scale that transforms the operational environment from a fog of war into something approaching a transparent battle space, transparent to the United States, opaque to Iran. And that asymmetry of awareness is the foundation of every other advantage the Laboon carries into the Persian Gulf. The AN/SPY-1 DV phased array radar mounted on the Laboon's superstructure, the air search radar. The SPY-1D, on subsequent reference, is the primary active sensor for the ship's Aegis Baseline 7 combat system. It is a four-faced phased array system that transmits radar energy simultaneously in all four cardinal directions without mechanical rotation, updating its tracking picture on every contact within its coverage volume every 2 to 4 seconds, depending on track priority. It tracks over 100 simultaneous contacts in air, surface, and littoral environments, and feeds that data directly into the Mark 99 fire control system that manages the ship's missile engagement sequences. The Iranian radar operators watching the Laboon know the SPY-1D is there. It is not a secret. What they do not know and cannot know from their vantage point on the Iranian coast is the totality of the sensor picture the Laboon is operating within. Because the SPY-1D is not the Laboon's most important sensor tonight. Her most important sensor is one she doesn't own. The Cooperative Engagement Capability, CEC, data link architecture that connects the Laboon to every other U.S. military asset in the Persian Gulf theater means that her tactical picture is not limited by her own radar's range or her own radar's altitude constraints. The P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol Aircraft, MPA on subsequent reference, that has been flying surveillance orbits at 25,000 feet over the Persian Gulf for the past 6 hours, is feeding radar tracks to the Laboon via CEC. At 25,000 feet, the Poseidon's AN/APY-10 multifunction radar has a radar horizon that extends to approximately 194 miles against sea-skimming targets, compared to the Laboon's own 12 to 13-mile horizon against the same targets. Every Nor cruise missile, every fast attack craft, and every small boat that launches from an Iranian port in the western Persian Gulf is visible to the Poseidon's radar at ranges measured in hundreds of miles, and those tracks appear on the Laboon's combat system display as if her own radar had found them. The Iranian coastal battery commander who believes the Noor's sea-skimming profile gives it a 93-mile blind approach to the Laboon has calculated correctly for a ship operating alone. He has calculated catastrophically wrongly for a ship operating inside a distributed sensor network that sees from orbit to wave surface simultaneously. Above the Poseidon, in geosynchronous orbit, the Space-Based Infrared System, SBIRS, constellation is watching every thermal event on the Persian Gulf's surface and shoreline, with sensors sensitive enough to detect the ignition of a missile engine within 3 to 4 seconds of first flame. Below the surface, At depths that make acoustic detection by Iranian sonars essentially impossible, a Los Angeles-class or Virginia-class fast attack submarine assigned to Fifth Fleet operations is running passive sonar collection on every acoustic signature in the western Persian Gulf, every Iranian fast attack craft that moves, every submarine that transits, every propeller cavitation signature from every naval vessel operating in Iranian waters. All of it is being catalogued, analyzed, and transmitted to the Laboon's tactical picture through the submarine's secure communication uplink. The IRGCN commander, watching the Laboon on his radar screen, thinks he has situational awareness of an isolated American destroyer threading provocatively through his claimed waters. He has situational awareness of the most visible node in a multi-domain intelligence collection architecture that is watching him, his forces, his facilities, and his decision-making processes in real time from space, from altitude, from the surface, and from the deep ocean simultaneously. But there is a layer of this invisible war that operates even more intimately with the threat environment, and it is the layer that most directly explains why the Laboon can operate at 11 nautical miles from the Iranian coast with a confidence that seems inexplicable from the outside. The AN/SLQ-32 V6 Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program. It's SAYP. Block 3, on subsequent reference, is the most capable shipboard electronic warfare system the United States has ever deployed on a surface combatant. It is installed on the Laboon and represents a generational leap from the AN/SLQ-32V2 system that older Arleigh Burke variants carried into the 1990s Gulf operations. Where the older system was a passive receiver and a noise jammer, the SWIP Block 3 uses the same gallium nitride semiconductor architecture that drives the EA-18G Growler's ALQ-249NGJMB to perform active, adaptive electronic attack against specific threat emitters. When an Iranian Noor missile guidance radar activates on the coastline, the SWIP Block 3 captures its frequency fingerprint in microseconds. When an IRGCN fast attack craft's fire control radar begins illuminating the Laboon for a missile targeting solution. The SWIP Block 3 has already characterized that radar's modulation scheme and is preparing a deceptive return signal before the Iranian operator has completed his target acquisition sequence. The Iranian fire control radar operator sees his targeting display show a valid lock. His confidence indicator is green. His system is telling him everything he needs to see to authorize an engagement. So what his system is actually showing him is a ghost, a mathematically crafted electromagnetic lie that the SWIP Block 3 has inserted into his radar's return processing chain with a precision his equipment has no mechanism to detect. He is building a weapons solution for a ship that is not at the coordinates his radar shows. By the time the physical reality of that discrepancy becomes apparent, the engagement window his doctrine required has closed. This isn't defensive jamming. This isn't electronic noise. This is the weaponization of the electromagnetic spectrum against the specific frequencies, specific modulation schemes, and specific targeting algorithms of known Iranian weapon systems, executed by a shipboard system that has been continuously updated with Iranian radar signature intelligence collected over years of Persian Gulf operations. The IRGCN operator, who activates his fire control radar against the Laboon, has just donated his radar's electromagnetic signature to a database that will be used to make the next deception more precise than the last. He has given us his password. He doesn't know it yet. The Laboon entered the 12-mile zone knowing exactly what electronic environment she would find there, because the last 6 destroyers that patrolled these waters collected it for her. The enemy's radar picture was wrong before he turned on his screen. But suppose the electronic deception encounters a gap. Suppose an IRGCN fast attack craft commander operating in radio silence with his fire control radar off and his targeting solution developed through passive optical and infrared tracking, a method that generates no electromagnetic emission for the SWIP Block 3 to defeat, has closed to within 9 miles of the Laboon at 65 knots before being detected. At 9 miles at 65 knots means approximately 8 minutes before he reaches minimum launch range for his C-14 anti-ship missiles. 8 minutes seems like enough time for a crewed warship to respond. Against a single fast attack craft, it would be. The Laboon's 5-inch Mark 45 deck gun, capable of firing 20 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, would engage a surface contact at 9 miles as a routine gunnery problem. But Iranian doctrine doesn't send a single fast attack craft. It sends a swarm. This is the coordination problem that defines IRGCN surface warfare doctrine and has genuinely complicated American naval planning in the Persian Gulf since the 1980s. The concept of swarm attack, simultaneously coordinating multiple fast attack craft approaching from different bearings, is staggered in time to maximize the number of simultaneous engagements the defending ship must manage, is designed specifically to exceed a single ship's engagement capacity. If 10 fast attack craft approach from 10 different bearings simultaneously, with closing speeds of 65 knots, the Laboon's gun mount can only engage one target at a time. Her ESSM missiles can engage multiple targets simultaneously, but each engagement consumes a finite round from a finite magazine. The question her commanding officer must answer in the first 30 seconds of a swarm attack is which targets get missiles, which targets get gun rounds, and which targets, if the math doesn't work, get through. The IRGCN commanders have studied this problem at their war college. They have a solution that they consider definitive. Send enough boats that the math never works for the defender. Here is where the Iranian analysis reaches the limit of what a hierarchical institution studying its own doctrine can see. Because the Laboon's commanding officer is not doing that math alone. He is not doing that math with only his ship's organic sensors and weapons. At the moment the swarm attack detection crosses the CEC threshold, the moment those fast attack craft contacts appear on the shared tactical picture and their converging course lines are analyzed by the Aegis Combat System's threat assessment algorithm, the response is not a single ship defending itself. It is a distributed kill web activating simultaneously across multiple platforms that the IRGCN fast attack craft commanders have no awareness of. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, a Romeo variant on subsequent reference, embarked on the Laboon's flight deck, has been airborne for 2 hours in a surveillance pattern that places it between the Laboon and the Iranian coastline at 200 feet altitude, which gives its AN/APS-153 multimode radar a sea surface coverage arc that closes the exact gap the Laboon's own radar creates at low altitude. The Romeo's crew has been watching those fast attack craft since they left their pier. They have been transmitting their tracks continuously. By the time the swarm attack reaches 9 miles from the Laboon, the Romeo has already prosecuted 2 of the outermost boats with AGM-114. Hellfire missiles, which are laser-guided, semi-active weapons with a range of approximately 5 miles and a warhead that generates a shaped charge jet of copper plasma at 25,000 feet per second. The shaped charge jet penetrates the aluminum hull of a 35-foot fast attack craft like a hot knife through paper. Yet the boat does not slow down. It does not stop. At 65 knots, when the Hellfire strikes, the kinetic energy of its own motion tears the destroyed hull apart in approximately 1 second. The remaining crew, if any, survive the initial penetration, are in the water in the dark Persian Gulf. The swarm has lost 2 platforms before it came within visual range of the Laboon. This is multi-domain coordination. We don't wait for threats to reach our defensive perimeter. We engage them at the edge of the helicopter's weapons range, which extends the Laboon's effective defensive radius from her own gun range of 9 miles to the Romeo's engagement range of 5 miles, plus its patrol radius of up to 30 miles from the ship. The outer boundary of the Laboon's defensive system is not her hull. It is 30 miles in every direction. patrolled continuously by a sensor and weapons platform that is nearly impossible to detect at night, and whose engagement of a fast attack craft generates no radar emission, no radio communication, and no warning to the other swarm boats that a friend has just been destroyed by a weapon they never saw coming. But suppose the swarm's inner boats, the ones the Romeo cannot reach before they enter their missile launch window, manage to fire their C-14 anti-ship missiles before being engaged. Multiple C-14 missiles are now inbound from different bearings at approximately 0.9 Mach. This is the scenario that the IRGCN's planning staff considers the decisive moment of the engagement, the moment where saturation exceeds the single ship's intercept capacity and at least one warhead reaches the Laboon's hull. Here is where the Aegis system's simultaneous engagement capacity becomes the physics argument that ends the Iranian calculation. The Mark 41 Vertical Launch System, VLS, it installed on the Laboon's forward and aft deckhouses, can fire multiple missiles in rapid succession with intervals measured in seconds. The EESSM Block 2 interceptor, with its active radar seeker in terminal phase, does not require the Laboon's fire control radar to maintain continuous illumination of the target throughout the engagement. Each ESSM, once launched, guides itself, which means the Laboon can launch 4 ESSMs in 4 seconds, each one self-guiding to a different threat, while simultaneously engaging a 5th contact with her Phalanx CIWS and a 6th contact with her 5-inch gun, and while the Romeo is prosecuting a 7th and 8th contact at extended range. Do the math on the simultaneous engagement capacity. The Laboon's organic systems can manage 6 to 8 simultaneous threat engagements. Her Romeo can add 2 to 4 more. The P-8A Poseidon overhead can contribute via its Mark 54 torpedoes and Harpoon anti-ship missiles against surface contacts if required. A swarm of 12 boats approaching simultaneously faces engagement capacity in the range of 10 to 14 simultaneous intercepts from assets already in the operational picture. Not 11 intercepts, not 9 intercepts, exactly 10 to 14 distributed across platforms, each one firing autonomously against its allocated target without requiring coordination through a human decision loop that could be overwhelmed by the speed of events. Now add the kinetic physics of what happens when a 150-pound Hellfire-shaped charge strikes a fiberglass fast attack craft traveling at 65 knots. The Hellfire's copper liner collapses under the detonation pressure of its explosive charge to form a hyper-velocity jet of superplastic copper, traveling at approximately 7,620 meters per second, roughly Mach 22, in a coherent stream approximately 3 centimeters in diameter. This jet penetrates approximately 800 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel armor. A fast attack craft hull is not steel, it is fiberglass or aluminum, typically 6 to 12 millimeters thick. Yes, the Hellfire jet enters the hull, traverses the engine compartment, and exits the opposite hull in approximately 3 milliseconds, depositing explosive energy and superheated copper fragments throughout the interior volume. The fuel cells ignite. The ammunition cook off. The boat is destroyed not by the initial penetration but by the catastrophic energy release inside its own hull while it is still traveling at 65 knots. Physics doesn't allow a graceful sinking. At 65 knots, the remnants of the hull impact the wave surface at an angle that generates more than enough G-force to pulverize the structural remains. There is no vessel left to photograph. There is no propaganda image. There is wreckage scattered across the wave surface and a thermal bloom visible to the Poseidon's sensors at 25,000 feet. This isn't naval combat. This is applied thermodynamics. We don't fight their boats. We delete them from the water using chemistry and velocity. And the process takes 3 milliseconds from warhead detonation to structural failure. Here is the question that every analysis of the Laboon's presence in Iran's claimed 12-mile zone must eventually answer, because it is the question that defines the entire strategic context of the deployment. Why is she there at all? But why is the United States Navy operating a $1.2 billion warship with 281 sailors inside the most heavily contested and most economically volatile 12 miles of water in the Persian Gulf? The answer is not geopolitical posturing, and it is not institutional arrogance. It is, as with every precision decision in naval warfare, a mathematics problem applied to biology, economics, and international law. And the answer has been calculated to a degree of precision that makes the ship's position not an approximation, but a determined output variable. Begin with the international law foundation, because it is the variable that Iranian strategic doctrine has systematically misrepresented to justify its own doctrine of exclusion. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which the United States observes as customary international law regardless of Senate ratification status, the 12 nautical mile territorial sea of a coastal state grants that state sovereignty over the water column, seabed, and airspace within that boundary. It does not, under Article 17 and 18 of UNCLOS, prohibit the innocent passage of foreign warships through territorial seas. Innocent passage is defined in UNCLOS Article 19 as passage that is not prejudicial to the peace, good order, or security of the coastal state, and which proceeds continuously and expeditiously. The Laboon, threading a transit course through the western Persian Gulf at 12 knots on a continuous track, conducting no weapons drills, launching no aircraft, engaging in no surveillance activities that UNCLOS specifically prohibits in innocent passage, is conducting exactly what Article 17 guarantees. The United States has conducted freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS, on subsequent reference. Under this legal framework continuously since 1979 and has done so in the Persian Gulf with sustained regularity since the 1980s. This is not a new policy. It is not a new legal position. It is a 47-year-old operational practice that the United States has applied consistently to every coastal state that asserts maritime boundary claims inconsistent with UNCLOS, including China in the South China Sea, Russia in the Black Sea approaches, and Iran in the Persian Gulf. The Laboon's presence is not a provocation under international law. It is a demonstration that international law applies universally and that the United States will not accept a precedent in which regional powers selectively exclude foreign military transit from waters that international law defines as passage corridors. But the law explains the right, not the purpose. The purpose is economic. The western Persian Gulf, adjacent to Iran's offshore oil infrastructure, is a choke point through which approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass every day, approximately 21% of global petroleum consumption, transiting an international waterway in vessels that depend on the freedom of navigation that the Laboon's presence is demonstrating. Every day that an Iranian patrol craft can physically block or threaten merchant shipping in that corridor represents an economic leverage point worth, at current oil prices, approximately $1.6 to $2.0 billion in daily global petroleum value. Iran's ability to credibly threaten that corridor is the foundation of its most significant geopolitical coercive tool, the ability to hold global energy markets hostage by threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz or the adjacent Persian Gulf transit corridors. The Laboon's presence inside the 12-mile zone is the physical demonstration that this threat is not credible, because the United States Navy operates freely in these waters at will, with or without Iranian consent. And any Iranian action to physically contest that passage initiates a response sequence whose conclusion benefits Iran in no scenario. Not in the scenario where they fire and hit. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. Not in the scenario where they fire and miss. not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not in the scenario where they fire and miss, not the scenario where they fire and miss, not in any scenario the IRGCN planning staff has been able to generate that produces a net strategic benefit to Iran. The Laboon is there because her presence in that exact position communicates something to every energy trader, every tanker company. Every government that depends on Persian Gulf oil, exports that no diplomatic communique can communicate with equivalent clarity. The corridor is open. It will remain open. And the decision to close it is not Iran's to make. Now apply the biological mathematics that underlies the specific position rather than the general presence. U.S. forces operating in the region, special operations personnel advising partner forces, diplomatic security teams protecting embassy staff, and intelligence collection teams in theater operate across a geographic footprint that extends from Iraq's Basra governorate in the north to Bahrain and Qatar in the south, a ground distance from the northernmost operating position to the nearest base at Navcent, Naval Forces Central Command, in Manama, Bahrain, of approximately 340 miles. Medical evacuation from a ground casualty to a Role 3 surgical facility, the level of care required to manage penetrating trauma with vascular injury, requires transport either to Bahrain, to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, or to a naval vessel equipped with a surgical suite. The Laboon, in her destroyer configuration, does not carry a full surgical suite, but she is part of a formation that includes vessels which do, and her position within the Persian Gulf places her as a forward coordination node for medevac routing. A 19-year-old corpsman second class from North Carolina stationed aboard a supporting vessel in the formation has been on watch in a trauma bay that has treated 4 casualties in the past 30 days. Yet his training has been built around a specific calculation. The time from casualty event to surgical incision must not exceed 52 minutes for a penetrating vascular injury in the operating environment. Not 58, not 46. Exactly 52, based on injury pattern data from the past 2 decades of Gulf operations and the specific hemodynamic response profiles for the demographics of personnel operating in theater. Do the math on how that 52-minute window constrains the fleet's operating position, 14 minutes for on-ground stabilization and movement to a landing zone, 8 minutes for helicopter spool-up and liftoff, 28 minutes of flight time remaining at MH-60 Herswau. cruise speed of 155 knots, which is 2.58 nautical miles per minute. 28 minutes at 2.58 nautical miles per minute equals a maximum medevac radius of 72 nautical miles from the supporting vessel. Yet the Laboon's patrol pattern keeps her within the combined defensive and medevac coverage zone of the formation, at a position that maximizes both the legal statement of freedom of navigation and the operational geometry of casualty response. Not 11 miles from the Iranian coast as a show of bravado, not 9 miles as a territorial challenge, exactly 11.4 nautical miles. The number that satisfies the legal transit requirement maintains the formation's medevac coverage geometry and places the ship within the optimal sensor coverage footprint of the supporting P-8A. That number was not chosen by the commanding officer's judgment. It was computed by a fleet operations planning cell whose output is expressed in tenths of nautical miles. Pull the lens back now from the Laboon herself to the full architecture that surrounds her. Because understanding why she can operate at 11 nautical miles from the Iranian coast with confidence requires seeing the entire system that she exists within. The Laboon is the visible piece. She is the chess piece whose position on the board is drawing attention. But the board extends far beyond what the IRGCN radar operators in Bandar Abbas can see on their screens. And the pieces they cannot see are the ones that determine the outcome of every scenario in their doctrine manual. At the center of the naval architecture in the Persian Gulf at any given moment is not the Laboon, but the command and control infrastructure at NavCent's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, which is managing a distributed combat force across approximately 2.5 million square miles of operational area. The Laboon's movements, her defensive status, her radar picture, and her communication logs are being monitored in real time by 5th Fleet watch officers who have pre-delegated engagement authority down to the Laboon's commanding officer for self-defense scenarios. The chain of decision that leads from a detected Iranian threat to a defensive engagement does not require a phone call to Bahrain. It does not require authorization from the strike group commander. Yet the rules of engagement in force for Persian Gulf operations delegate self-defense authority to the commanding officer immediately upon detection of a hostile act or demonstrated hostile intent, with the Aegis Combat System's threat assessment algorithms providing the technical foundation for the hostile intent determination. This means the Laboon's response to an Iranian missile launch is not delayed by human decision latency in a command chain. It is executed at machine speed, right within the parameters pre-authorized by commanders who anticipated this exact scenario. The P-8A Poseidon flying at 25,000 feet is not merely a sensor node. It carries a weapons payload that makes it a genuine anti-surface warfare asset. Its Harpoon anti-ship missiles, if loaded for this mission, carry a 221-kilogram warhead with active radar terminal guidance and a range of approximately 150 kilometers. Its Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes can engage any Iranian submarine that attempts to exploit the Laboon's shallow water operating environment. The P-8A's crew of 9, including 2 tactical coordinators with sensor management and weapons authorization responsibilities, is the airborne management layer for the entire surface and subsurface picture in the Laboon's operating area. When the Poseidon's radar tracks an Iranian fast attack craft departing Bandar Abbas at 0000 hours on a course converging with the Laboon, that track information arrives on the Laboon's combat display within seconds. The Laboon's commanding officer knows the threat is coming before the IRGCN commander has decided whether to transmit his attack order. The Virginia-class submarine operating in support of 5th Fleet and in the current operational environment. At least one Virginia-class hull is continuously assigned to Persian Gulf area operations, carries Tomahawk Block 5 land attack cruise missiles TLAM with GPS coordinates pre-programmed for every Iranian naval base, coastal defense battery installation, and command node in the western Persian Gulf within range. The targeting packages for those TLAMs were not programmed on the day the crisis escalated. They were programmed during workup exercises 6 months ago. refined by real-time intelligence updates and validated by targeting analysts at Fifth Fleet before the submarine ever transited into the operating area. If the decision is made to strike the origin point of a Khalij Fars ballistic missile that was fired at the Laboon, the TLAM launch sequence takes 11 minutes from execute order to first missile in flight. The Iranian coastal battery that fired is destroyed 47 minutes after the missile that fired from it was launched. The Iranian crew responsible has approximately 47 minutes of operational existence remaining from the moment they press the launch button. The submarine that delivers that consequence has never appeared on any Iranian radar screen, has never been acquired by any Iranian sonar, and will not be locatable by any Iranian asset in the aftermath. The consequence arrives. The origin remains unknown to Iranian intelligence. The strategic ambiguity compounds the deterrent effect. This is not a single destroyer operating in defiant isolation inside a hostile maritime zone. This is the Laboon as a visible node in a distributed, multi-domain, multi-platform combat architecture that encompasses orbital satellites, high-altitude surveillance aircraft, the surface ship herself, an embarked helicopter, a submerged submarine, and command nodes ashore, all connected through secure data links operating at speeds measured in microseconds. It all sharing a common operational picture that makes the Laboon's commanding officer simultaneously the captain of his ship and the operator of a kill web that extends 300 miles in every direction from his hull. Remove the P-8A and the over-horizon sensor coverage degrades, but the Aegis radar and SEWIP Block 3 still function. Remove the submarine and the deep strike deterrent is reduced, but the surface and air response capacity remains. Remove the helicopter, and the outer defensive perimeter contracts, but the inner defensive layers tighten. The system has been designed with redundancy at every layer, because the engineers and operational planners who built it understood that nothing in combat is certain, and that the only response to uncertainty is depth multiplied by simultaneity. This isn't a destroyer on a solo patrol. This is a networked deterrent system wearing a destroyer as its forward face. And the IRGCN command. Looking at their radar screen is seeing the face without understanding the body behind it. Return now to 0510 hours in the Persian Gulf, to the IRGCN radar operators watching the Laboon's contact trace through their claimed territorial waters. To the fast attack craft commanders who have received notification of the American destroyer's position and are waiting for orders from a command structure that is simultaneously watching, calculating, and hesitating, because somewhere in the IRGCN planning apparatus, an analyst has run the full scenario and arrived at an answer that is inconvenient for the commanders who want to make a statement. The Laboon is not alone. The Laboon is never alone. The water around her and the sky above her and the deep ocean below her are filled with American sensors and American weapons that the IRGCN cannot see, cannot locate, and cannot neutralize before they activate. The cost of firing at the Laboon is not the cost of one engagement. It is the cost of everything that follows. The TLAM strikes on the facilities that fired, the air operations that will be authorized within hours, the economic consequences of a military exchange with the United States Navy that the Iranian economy, already under maximum sanctions pressure, cannot absorb without systemic failure. The fast attack craft commanders know their boats, they know their missiles. What they don't know, and what no briefing from their headquarters can fully convey, is what they cannot see. And in modern naval warfare, what you cannot see is exactly what kills you. 3 hours from now, at 0810 hours, the Laboon will complete her transit of the contested zone, log her position data as a freedom of navigation operation in the 5th Fleet operational record, and continue east toward the Strait of Hormuz. No shot will have been fired. No confrontation will have occurred. The Iranian radar operators will have watched her cross their claimed boundary, proceed through it, and exit without incident. From the outside, this looks like nothing happened. What actually happened was a comprehensive demonstration of military deterrence conducted at 11 nautical miles from an adversary's coastline in the most economically critical body of water on Earth. It executed with a precision that makes 11.4 nautical miles not an approximation but a variable solved to 4 significant figures. Not 11 miles, not 12 miles. Exactly 11.4. The number where international law, operational geometry, sensor coverage, medevac mathematics, and deterrence credibility all converge to a single answer. The 19-year-old Corpsman second class from North Carolina, who was on watch in the trauma bay during the transit, will never know that his presence in that trauma bay was part of the deterrent calculation. He will never read the operational planning document that placed his ship within his specific medevac radius. He will go on watch, stand his hours, maintain his kit, and be ready for a patient who, tonight, does not come because the architecture that surrounds him has done its job silently, yet invisibly, and with a completeness that leaves the adversary no rational path to engagement. That silence is the victory. That empty trauma bay is the outcome that every calculation in the operational plan was designed to produce. American naval deterrence doesn't always announce itself with explosions and headlines. Sometimes it announces itself by sailing through water that a regional power claims is closed and demonstrating by the simple fact of uncontested passage, yet that the closure was never real. This isn't a freedom of navigation operation. This is sovereignty physics. The line between international waters and a regional power's ambitions is drawn not on charts, but in the operational confidence of a crew that has calculated every variable, pre-authorized every response, and sailed into the most contested maritime zone in the world, knowing that the math was already solved before the first watch was stood. The numbers don't blink. The formation holds. Yet the passage was always open. Now it has been proven again, one transit at a time, by a ship and her crew who turned 11.4 nautical miles into a statement that no diplomatic cable could have delivered with equal precision. The equations are validated. The line holds. If this complete breakdown of why the USS Laboon entered Iran's 12-mile zone, and why that decision was a precision calculation, not a provocation, changed how you understand freedom of navigation operations and the mathematics of naval deterrence, type passage in the comments right now. Tell us whether you think Iran understands what it's looking at when it watches an American destroyer transit its claimed waters. If you want the deep dive into how FONOPs are planned, how the rules of engagement work in the Persian Gulf specifically, and what the legal architecture actually says about warships in territorial seas, that analysis is the next episode. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The transit never stops. The watch is unbroken. The numbers were right the first time.